Would you still overwork your employees if one of them collapsed right in front of you? The teen's trembling voice echoed through the restaurant, silencing every sound of clinking plates and murmured chatter. Before we go any further, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Kindness Tales Live, because what happens next will leave you speechless. It was a bustling Friday night at Bistro Bloom, one of the city's most popular restaurants. Customers filled every corner, the air buzzing with the sound of sizzling food, laughter, and orders shouted across the kitchen. Among the staff was Ethan, a 17-year-old part-time waiter who had been working there for the last 6 months to help his mother pay rent after his father's accident. His eyes were tired, his back ached, and his uniform was soaked in sweat. But still, he smiled at every customer, no matter how rude or impatient they were. That night, though, something felt different. The manager, Mr. Dalton, was unusually tense. A special guest was dining that evening, someone the staff were told to treat like royalty. "Everything must be perfect," Dalton barked. "No mistakes, no delays." Ethan nodded and hurried back to the kitchen, balancing a tray of dishes. He was already on his 10th hour of work. He had barely eaten and his legs felt like lead. His friend Maya, another teen waitress, whispered, "You okay, Ethan? You look pale." "I'm fine," he muttered, forcing a smile. "Just one more hour." When the special guest arrived, everyone froze. He was a quiet man in his 40s, wearing a simple gray jacket and no jewelry. Nothing about him screamed, "important." He sat in the corner, observing everything quietly. The staff whispered that he was a mystery investor, someone who might buy shares in the restaurant chain. As the night went on, orders kept piling up. The kitchen was chaos and the manager's temper boiled over. "Ethan, table 7's waiting." "Move faster," he shouted. Ethan rushed out, hands trembling from exhaustion. Just as he set down a tray, his vision blurred. He stumbled and almost dropped it, catching himself on the counter. The customers frowned. Dalton snapped, "If you can't handle simple work, maybe you should find another job." Something inside Ethan broke. He looked around. The tired faces of his co-workers, the yelling, the endless pressure. His voice shook as he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe I should. Maybe we all should. We're treated like machines here. You don't care if we're sick or hungry, you just want results." The room fell silent. Every customer stared. Mr. Dalton's face went red with anger. "Watch your mouth, boy. You're lucky to even have this job," he barked. But before he could say more, the quiet man in the corner stood up. Everyone froze. "Actually," the man said calmly, "I'd like to hear what he has to say." Dalton turned nervously. "Sir, please, this kid doesn't know what he's talking about." But the man held up a hand. "No, let him speak." Ethan's heart pounded. He couldn't believe someone important wanted to listen. "We work double shifts without breaks," he said softly. "And if anyone complains, we're threatened with being fired. We're just kids trying to survive, sir." The man nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. "Thank you for your honesty." Then he turned to Dalton. "We'll continue this conversation privately." His tone was calm but carried a weight that made even the manager pale. The mysterious guest left soon after, leaving everyone whispering. Ethan was sure he had just lost his job. Maya squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Maybe someone finally listened. That night, Ethan walked home under the flickering streetlights, unaware that his words had set off a chain of events that would soon make national headlines. Morning sunlight poured into Bistro Bloom, but the usual excitement was gone. Every worker moved nervously, whispering about what had happened the night before. Ethan hadn't shown up for his shift. He assumed he'd been fired for speaking up. The manager, Mr. Dalton, paced near the counter, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his face tense. Then, at exactly 9 a.m., a black SUV rolled up to the front door. The tinted windows reflected the early light like dark mirrors. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The door opened slowly, and the same quiet man from last night stepped out. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 suited assistants followed him, carrying folders and tablets. Dalton rushed forward, smiling nervously. Sir, what a surprise." "I didn't expect them." The man held up a hand. "Good morning, Mr. Dalton. I'd like to speak to your entire staff in the dining area. Now." Within minutes, the restaurant filled with employees, chefs, waiters, dishwashers, even the janitor. Their eyes darted between Dalton and the visitor. The man stood calmly, then spoke, his voice deep and steady. My name, he said, is James Arden. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Bloom Hospitality Group, the company that owns this restaurant and 23 others across the country. The room gasped. Dalton's fake smile froze. Sir, I didn't realize you were visiting us in person. James continued. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Dalton. No one did. He turned his gaze toward the staff. Last night I came here undercover to observe how my employees were treated on a regular night. What I witnessed disturbed me. Maya clutched her apron. The cooks exchanged nervous glances. James's expression softened as he looked around. I saw exhaustion, fear, overwork. And then I heard a young man, Ethan, I believe, speak with courage about something no one should have to suffer at their workplace. Dalton interrupted quickly. Sir, that boy was exaggerating. These teens are lazy. They don't understand discipline. James turned sharply, his voice like steel. Enough. The room went dead silent. Even the humming refrigerator seemed to quiet. Discipline, James said slowly, is not the same as abuse. Leadership is not shouting orders. It's about responsibility, respect, and empathy. He walked toward Dalton. Tell me, how many hours did Ethan work yesterday? Dalton hesitated. He started at 10 in the morning, left around midnight. 14 hours? James's brow furrowed. And you allowed a minor to work that long without a meal break? Dalton stammered. We were short-staffed. Because you cut shifts to save labor costs, didn't you? James asked calmly. The manager's silence was his answer. James sighed, turned to the others and said, From this moment, Mr. Dalton, you are relieved of your managerial duties. Effective immediately. Gasps filled the room. The manager's face drained of color. Sir, please. James raised a hand. You had your chance. You failed these people. Then, turning toward the staff, he said gently, No one here will lose their job. In fact, starting today, we're implementing fair scheduling, mandatory breaks, and education support for all part-time workers under 18. You deserve better. Tears welled in Maya's eyes. A dishwasher whispered, He's really doing it. Just then the door opened and Ethan walked in. His backpack slung over one shoulder, he looked confused as everyone turned toward him. I came to return my uniform, he murmured. James smiled warmly. Ethan, right? You don't need to return that. You're not fired. Ethan blinked. I'm not? No, James said. In fact, I owe you an apology and my thanks. Dalton tried to interject, but the CEO's assistants escorted him outside quietly. James walked closer to Ethan. Your courage made me see the truth that I couldn't see from my office boardroom. You reminded me that our company's heart isn't the brand, it's the people who work for it. Ethan's throat tightened. I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. You didn't cause trouble, James said gently. You sparked change. Applause erupted across the restaurant, soft at first, then stronger. Some clapped, others wiped tears from their faces. Even the kitchen staff came out, smiling for the first time in months. James looked around with pride. This place will no longer run on fear. It will run on kindness. As the black SUV drove away later, Ethan stood at the window, watching, not realizing that James Arden had one more surprise in store for him. One that would change his entire future. The next morning, Ethan's alarm buzzed at 7 a.m., but for once he didn't feel dread. He still couldn't believe what had happened the previous day. The CEO himself had stood up for him, fired the cruel manager, and promised change. Still, part of him wondered if it was real. Maybe once the cameras and reporters left, everything would go back to normal. As he stepped outside his small apartment, he saw something parked on the street that made him freeze. The same black SUV. The door opened and James Arden, dressed in a crisp blue shirt this time, stepped out with a warm smile. Morning, Ethan, he said casually, as if visiting an old friend. Ethan blinked, speechless. Sir, what are you doing here? I came to talk, James said. Mind if I walk with you? They strolled down the quiet street toward a nearby cafe. Ethan kept glancing at the CEO, unsure how to act. James, however, spoke gently, asking about Ethan's school, his dreams, his life. I used to love science, Ethan said quietly. But when my dad got injured, I dropped out to work full-time. Mom's been doing her best, but things are hard. James nodded thoughtfully. You're 17, right? Yeah. Do you still want to study? Ethan hesitated. Of course. I want to be an engineer someday. But college feels impossible now. James smiled faintly. What if it wasn't? Ethan frowned, not understanding. Then James placed a small folder on the cafe table and slid it toward him. Inside was a scholarship form with the Bloom Foundation logo. Ethan's eyes widened. This is, James nodded, a full scholarship. We've decided to launch a new program, the Young Dreamers Initiative, to support hardworking students like you. You'll get financial aid, mentorship, and part-time work at our company if you choose. You inspired it. Ethan stared at the paper, his hands trembling. You're serious? Dead serious, James said. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What it means to start with nothing. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. His throat tightened and tears welled up in his eyes. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep believing in yourself, James said softly. And maybe, one day you'll do the same for someone else. Across town, word spread quickly. Local news stations began running the story. Teens' courage inspires CEO to reform company policies. People flooded Bistro Bloom with positive reviews, praising the change. Customers returned, this time noticing something new. The staff smiled genuinely. Breaks were scheduled, hours were fair, and a small sign hung by the counter. We don't serve food. We serve people. When Ethan returned to the restaurant that weekend to pick up his final paycheck, the new interim manager, Mrs. Holloway, greeted him warmly. You're somewhat of a hero around here, she chuckled. Mr. Arden told me to expect great things from you. Ethan smiled shyly. I'm just glad people listened. But as he turned to leave, he noticed a group of young workers whispering near the counter. New hires, probably his age. One girl said softly, That's the guy who spoke up. Another added, He changed everything for us. Ethan's heart swelled with pride. He realized he hadn't just fought for himself. He'd given others a voice, too. Later that evening, his mom came home from her double shift at the hospital. When Ethan handed her the scholarship letter, she froze, covering her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Ethan, this can't be real. It is, Mom, he said, hugging her. We don't have to worry anymore. She held him tightly. Your father would be so proud. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the past few days. The anger, the fear, the courage, and now, hope. He whispered to himself, one voice can really make a difference. But he didn't know that the difference was only beginning, because James Arden wasn't done. He had one more test for Ethan, something that would determine just how strong his heart really was. A few weeks had passed since the day Ethan received his scholarship. His life was slowly transforming. He had re-enrolled in school, his mother looked less worried, and the restaurant had turned into a model workplace. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Then one morning, Ethan received a call from an unknown number. Hello? He answered. Ethan, it's James Arden, said the familiar, calm voice. I hope I'm not interrupting. Ethan sat upright instantly. No, sir. Of course not. I need your help, James continued. There's something important happening at one of our other restaurants across town, and I'd like you to come with me today. Within an hour, the black SUV once again pulled up outside Ethan's building. As they drove through the city, James explained, Bistro Bloom's changes were only the beginning. I need to know if our message of compassion can survive beyond one location, and I want you to see something for yourself. When they arrived, the sign above the door read Bloom Grill. The place looked elegant, but as soon as they stepped inside, Ethan could feel the tension. Workers moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. A manager with slicked back hair barked orders near the kitchen. Looks familiar, doesn't it? James said quietly. Ethan nodded. Just like how our place used to be. James whispered, This is one of our highest earning locations, and one of the most toxic. I want to see if the culture can change from within. I'm going in as a silent observer again. You, however, will work here for a week, anonymously. No one should know who you are. Ethan blinked. You mean undercover? James smiled. Exactly. Consider it a leadership test. That afternoon, Ethan put on a server's uniform and began his shift. The kitchen heat was unbearable, the staff exhausted, and the manager, Mr. Greaves, seemed to enjoy yelling more than managing. "Move it, rookie," he snapped. "You drop one more plate and you're out." Ethan clenched his fist but stayed calm. He remembered James's words. Change doesn't start with anger. It starts with example. Over the next few days, Ethan quietly helped where he could. When a dishwasher fainted from exhaustion, Ethan gave him water and took over his shift until the man recovered. When a new waitress cried after being scolded unfairly, Ethan comforted her during her break. Soon, whispers spread. That new kid's different. He actually cares. On the 5th day during the dinner rush, a customer spilled soup and yelled angrily at a young waitress. Mr. Greaves stormed over, ready to humiliate her publicly. But before he could, Ethan stepped forward. "Sir, please," he said gently. "She's doing her best. It was an accident. I'll clean it up." The customer calmed down, muttering an apology. But Greaves glared. "You don't speak for me, boy. Who do you think you are?" Ethan took a deep breath. Someone who believes people work better when they're treated with kindness, not fear. The restaurant went silent. Every eye turned toward them. Greaves sneered. "If you don't like how I run things, there's the door." Before Ethan could respond, a familiar voice came from the back of the room. "Actually, Mr. Greaves, there's the door, and it's yours to use." James Arden stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. Gasps filled the restaurant. The manager froze, realizing who had been standing just a few tables away all week. "Sir, I didn't know." "That's the problem," James interrupted. "You didn't care to know. About your team. About their well-being." He turned to the staff. "I've watched this young man lead with empathy, courage, and patience. That's the kind of leadership this company needs." Then he turned to Ethan, smiling. "You passed the test." Ethan's eyes widened. "Test?" James nodded. "I wanted to see if you could live by your own words, to change the world without raising your voice. You proved it." The staff broke into applause. Some cried. The young waitress Ethan defended hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that evening, as they stood outside under the streetlights, James said quietly, "Ethan, leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. You have that gift." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "I just did what felt right." "That's exactly why it was right," James replied. A month had passed since Ethan's undercover test, and his life felt like something out of a dream. Every restaurant under the Bloom Hospitality Group had begun adopting new policies inspired by his story. Fair schedules, health programs, and scholarship opportunities for young employees. For the first time in years, Ethan felt hope everywhere he went. Yet he still wondered why James hadn't called in weeks. Had the CEO moved on to new projects? Or was his role in the story finally over? That question was answered one sunny afternoon when Ethan's phone buzzed. "Ethan, it's James. Can you come to headquarters today? I have something important to show you." 2 hours later, the black SUV stopped in front of a towering glass building with the words Bloom Hospitality Group gleaming on the front. Ethan followed James inside, his heart racing. The elevator doors opened to a spacious conference room filled with reporters, cameras, and smiling employees. James motioned for Ethan to stand beside him. "Don't be nervous," he whispered. "You've earned this moment." Then, in front of everyone, James stepped to the podium. "Good afternoon. Today I want to share a story about courage, not from a boardroom but from a restaurant floor." The crowd quieted. "A few weeks ago," James continued, "a 17-year-old part-time worker taught me more about leadership than any corporate seminar ever could. When he stood up against unfair treatment, he reminded us all what humanity in business truly means." He turned to Ethan. "That young man is standing beside me right now. Ethan Parker." Cameras flashed. Ethan's face turned red as reporters clapped. He could hardly believe it. James went on. "From today onward, our company will launch a new nationwide initiative called The Heart of Bloom, a program dedicated to empowering young workers, improving labor conditions, and funding education for underprivileged students. And to lead this project, I've chosen someone who embodies courage, kindness, and responsibility." He paused, smiling proudly. "Ethan Parker, Will you accept the position of youth advisor and ambassador for Bloom Foundation? Ethan froze. Mimi, sir, I'm just a student, James chuckled. A student who already knows what real leadership looks like. The room erupted into applause. Tears filled Ethan's eyes as he shook James's hand. Thank you, sir, for believing in me. James smiled. No, Ethan. Thank you for reminding us all to believe in people again. After the event, reporters surrounded Ethan with questions. What gave you the courage to speak up? One asked. Ethan thought for a moment and replied softly, because sometimes staying silent hurts more than speaking the truth. I didn't want to be brave. I just wanted to be honest. His answer spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, the story was trending under hashtags like kindness at work, Connor Heart of Bloom, and teen hero. People everywhere began sharing their own experiences, inspired by Ethan's courage. That night, Ethan and James sat on the rooftop terrace of the building, watching the city lights. You know, James said quietly, I started this company 20 years ago to chase success, but you helped me rediscover purpose. Ethan smiled. And you showed me that kindness isn't weakness and it's strength. James nodded. Exactly. Remember that wherever life takes you. They stood there in silence for a while, mentor and student, CEO and teen, bound by one shared belief. Change begins with compassion. Weeks later, Ethan returned to school full-time, studying engineering by day and working as an ambassador for the Bloom Foundation on weekends. His mom proudly hung the company article on their living room wall. Every time Ethan looked at it, he didn't see fame or reward. He saw a voice that finally mattered. Months later, as he walked past a new Bloom restaurant, he noticed something that made him stop. A plaque on the wall read, Inspired by one voice that dared to speak truth, dedicated to those who work with heart. The Heart of Bloom Initiative. Ethan smiled, whispering, We really did change things.